And hello, how's it going?
Hello. Doing well. How are you?
Good, how about you?
Very good, very good. So, welcome. Today, Tanya Henderson and Rod O'Connor are joining me, Steve Endo, to talk about Dynamics GP versus Business Central. And we were asked to talk about this for a small group of consultants. And I think it collected a lot of good information. So I thought we would share this and just live stream it and put it up on YouTube and Periscope and Twitch so that people could see it. And if you're coming from the Dynamics GP world or from a different ERP system or a different environment, you could learn a little bit more about the two systems and see what you think. So thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to start by going through PowerPoint and jumping between some slides here. And I will see if I can figure out how to operate this machinery in the background. So let's try this. Okay, so as you see, Tanya, Rod, and I are here today, and here's our kind of our social media information, Twitter and blog and YouTube, etc. And one starting place is a blog post that I wrote back in April 2019. And I personally had a challenge trying to keep track of all the Business Central resources that were just blasting out from all over the place in 2019 when I was starting to come up to speed with Business Central. And so I figured, okay, let me just write these down somewhere. And I was tracking them in OneNote, in Twitter bookmarks. I was just all over the place. So I figured I would put them all in a blog post and make them accessible to everyone and try to share all the resources I've collected. And now, as of February 2021, I have over 200 different links, and those are Microsoft resources, training, conferences, Twitter handles, YouTube channels, you name it, blogs. And there is a bit.ly link, as you see at the top here, bit.ly/BC resources. So that is one place to get started if you're interested in Business Central. So with that shameless plug, let's move on. So the background of this is to just share our thoughts and impressions as of February 2021, based on our experience with Dynamics GP and with Business Central so far. We're just sharing our thoughts and opinions based on our personal experiences and what we've read or heard. This is absolutely not an exhaustive or complete or comprehensive comparison or feature by feature comparison, pros and cons, anything like that. And this is not a fact or truths or good versus bad. We're not trying to make judgments here. We're just trying to share kind of like, okay, there's a weakness here, there's a pitfall here, there's a good feature here, or there's some nice features there. So that's just the idea, is just to share that. And caveat is that Business Central is changing very rapidly. So anything we say here, even anything you may read or other resources, they may be old or out of date. So even 3 months after a blog post is published, or even 6 or 12 months particularly, it is likely that something has changed in the system that may alter the how you interpret that information and whether you can use it. So just be aware, there's a rapid change in this industry. So, okay, with that, Rod and Tanya, anything you want to share before we jump in?
No,
No, I
you're
think I'm
okay.
good.
You're good. Okay, excellent. So I think one of the fundamental differences that most people will see is that Dynamics GP is traditionally an on-premises software application. And Business Central is now being pushed as a SaaS, or software as a service, ERP solution. So Tanya, Rod, and I have many years of experience with GP, and we have a couple of years. Rod, you have several years of experience with Business Central now, right?
It's when did Madeira become not Madeira. It was about 4 years ago now, I think.
Okay. Yeah, 2017,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
2018, something like that. Okay. And that was
yeah,
the
somewhere around there.
early days. Okay. So you've started working with it since then, and you implemented it yourself for your business at the time.
Yeah, we implement. Actually, I wrote a blog post about that back in the day as well.
That's
Um,
right. You had a whole series on it.
yeah, and
Okay.
so basically, we implemented it. I implemented it internally, just kind of on a lark. I just wanted to see. I was a old school GP person, wanted to see if what this whole thing was about and if I could run my business on it. And within a weekend, I decided to go ahead and keep doing it.
Excellent.
So
And Tanya, you've been using or working with and learning Business Central for over a year, 2 years
Oh,
almost?
it's been about 3 years.
Oh, 3 years.
Three.
Okay, got it, got it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm the newbie then.
Yep.
I started like trying to follow Business Central in 2019, and I attended a couple Directions NA conferences, but I don't think I really dug into it until late 2019, and so I'm relatively new. Okay, so jumping back to the slides here. Dynamics GP is typically an on-premises application, so it runs on a SQL server, and the GP application is installed on desktop or on terminal or Citrix servers. You can have a hosted option, whether that's on Azure or hosted with a hosting provider. There are many partners hosting nowadays. And typically, I found the desktop application is used, but Tanya has shared with me that she does have several clients that are using the Dynamics GP web client, so that is an option. And with Dynamics GP, you, the customer, you, the partner, consultant, or if you have a hosting provider, you are essentially responsible for setting up your environment, installing, configuring, implementing upgrades, service packs, backups. If you have a technical issue, sometimes you may have to fix that yourself. So that is your responsibility. Microsoft does not hand you an environment or host anything for you. I found that Dynamics GP, for the type of work that I do, I work with customers that have very high transaction volume. So talking hundreds of thousands of transactions a day and up to 2 million transactions a day in one case. So I have seen plenty of evidence that Dynamics GP can scale very well and handle very high volume and high capacity environments with the appropriate hardware, of course. One of the benefits of Dynamics GP that many of us take advantage of is that the SQL databases are directly accessible. So you can query them, you can run reports against them, you can have an integration that retrieves data directly from SQL and exports it, for example. So that's very convenient. Now, BC SaaS, on the other hand, and I'll get to a note about the on-prem version of BC, but the SaaS version of BC, or BC Online, that is a turnkey environment. With a couple of clicks, Microsoft provides you with an entire environment up and running in minutes, and you have a web application and a native mobile app that you are using right away. You do not have to set up an environment. You don't need to install anything, have any DVDs. You need to configure the settings of that, but you're not needing to configure the base software. So that's really nice. If you're looking to get up and running quickly, low cost, Business Central SaaS is a pretty appealing option. Business Central currently is on a 6-month major release upgrade cycle. They call it Wave 1 and Wave 2 for, say, March and October, I believe, or April and October are the release dates. And they often have monthly minor updates, and those are automatic. You do not need to do anything to have those updates applied. You can go into what's called the admin center. You can schedule those for a particular day of the month or day of the week and time of day, and you can have a 30 or 60-day window, I believe, for a major upgrade in case you want to defer it for a couple weeks. But those are automatic. You'll wake up, you'll see you received an email at 4 a.m. Your upgrade has been completed successfully. So that's a huge, huge benefit of the SaaS environment. One potential limitation for some customers might be that at this time, there is a standard database limit of 80 gigabytes, and that is per tenant or environment. So if you have multiple companies, those share the 80 gigabyte database limit. And also related to that, SQL Server databases are not directly accessible. So pros and cons there. And there are other ways to get to your data, so that's not a severe restriction, but it's not quite the same as what you might be used to with Dynamics GP. And one very, very nice thing is using the Azure SQL backend for Business Central, you have automatic constant backups. And those backups can be downloaded as what are called backpack files in case you want to restore them to a Docker environment or an on-prem version of Business Central. And now with I believe the April 2021 release, they are offering point-in-time restores. So you're getting the full SQL Server enterprise grade backup and restore functionality through a web admin interface. And Business Central has full integrations to your Office 365 and Azure Active Directory platforms. So your users are administered through those licensing platforms. So how did I do there? Any questions, thoughts, anything I missed?
The one thing I might add there is a lot of people, especially partners, get scared of the lack of SQL access because we're used to supporting it through the back end. My experience so far has been that support has been really good about issues that I've run into, and I haven't been seeing the same types of issues that we would see in a GP environment. Everyone always asks me about what do you do when a batch gets stuck, and I just don't experience the same thing in the VC side. So it hasn't been an issue for me. Tanya, you do a bit more of that now. I don't know if you agree.
Yep. No, that was exactly what I was going to add too, is that stuck batch. That's the question we always get is, well, what happens when my batch gets stuck? Well, there really isn't that. And to add on top of that is, people say, well, I want to be able to see my data. It's not that you can't see the data, because there's multiple ways through API, web services, OData feeds, things like that to get to the data. And you can see the tables, right there in Business Central, or just in the HTML, just by looking at the web services. So, I kind of say, well, you can still see the data just like you can in SQL.
Yeah, it's very accessible, and to your point, Rod, I'm assuming there are some technical back-end problems, and those would need to be fixed by Microsoft. But in my limited experience so far, those are not nearly as common as what we would see in the GP world.
Yeah. And like I said before,
I will
Microsoft
say that
was super responsive.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, and I was going to say too, the one thing that I've noticed is that if you do have the backend problems, you put in a support request, and they do have some scripting and things that they can do in order to fix some of those data issues, if you have them. But the idea of having them is pretty much going away.
Excellent. Okay, so let's jump into the pricing and licensing. So one difference has been that GP has traditionally been licensed as a perpetual license. So you purchase the license and then you pay an annual maintenance fee for service packs, upgrades, etc. And so for some customers, that initial licensing fee could be a significant outlay of cash. It's a pretty significant purchase. And Dynamics GP does have additional add-ons, whether that's additional functionality for things like manufacturing and field service, or the development and integration tools, which are now an extra charge. So that's a pretty significant cost. There are hosted subscription options. So there are partners who, rather than charging those license fees to the customer, they just charge a monthly fee per user for your Dynamics GP hosted solution. So that has changed the licensing option for many customers and lowers that initial entry cost. And then on top of that base GP licensing, you have ISV licenses or subscriptions. And so those are extra, and that's pretty standard. And one, I guess, from an economic point of view for the consultants and partners looking to that are weighing GP versus BC and whether they transition, one difference that is pretty significant is that GP partners typically received meaningful margins on the sale of Dynamics GP as well as ISV Solutions. I don't know what those margins are, but let's say it's 15, 20% or more. That could be pretty significant pretty significant source of revenue on the sale of the software as well as ISV licenses. And I believe there's also a partner margin on the annual maintenance fees. So it is a source of revenue for many partners in the GP world. Whereas Business Central SaaS really changes the licensing and pricing model significantly for us GP folks. The standard subscription, which is called Essentials, is only $70 per user per month. And that, I believe, is a pretty low price point. There is a premium option which adds, I think, manufacturing and field service, a couple modules that are lesser used, at least in the GP world. That's $100, which still is an excellent value. There is an $8 team license for limited access and like workflows and things like that. And there are nonprofit discounts, but the per user monthly subscription where you just sign up and pay $70 per user, take your credit card, that is quite a contrast. And a contrast from GP is that Business Central development tools and integration tools are 100% free. In the case of the development tools, anyone in the world can download and set up a full Business Central development environment, and it's pretty amazing. So zero cost to start developing against Business Central. Now, unlike GP, my understanding is there is minimal partner margin for Business Central subscriptions. It's only like a couple dollars per user per month. So if you are expecting to, as a partner, to make money off of your Business Central user base subscriptions, you will need a lot of users under your partner umbrella to make that happen. So thoughts on that, perpetual versus subscription?
So I have a thought, which is, when we did this the other day, I don't think we brought this up. One of the very big differences, obviously, between GP and Business Central, though, is also the concurrent licensing versus a named license. So absolutely agree. You are losing the margin on selling those users and selling the enhancement, but they may need more users in Business Central than they actually did in GP. I definitely see that.
That is a very interesting point because Business Central is named users.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Got it.
I have had some people that have said, like we have a reporting, at testteam.com, and that's used by people who are just doing stuff in the back end. But if somebody's needing to log in, you don't want to have to switch out of your username and all of this stuff for $70 a month.
Got it.
So
okay.
Customers are really getting another license.
That's a good point. Whereas GP is concurrent users, so you could have 100 users set up with only 10 user licenses.
Right.
Yep.
Got it. Okay. Very good point.
I wouldn't want to be in that environment, though. That'd be a lot of people sharing 10 licenses.
Yeah. Although I do regularly work with customers on support tickets where they cannot log in because they have maxed out their GP user count. So there is definitely
all the time.
Yep. There is definitely a desire to conserve on GP licenses, conserve the cost because they are not cheap. Whereas that could actually be a pro for Business Central. You're much more willing to pay $70 a month for that additional user license, right?
Right.
From a small company perspective as well, the whole licensing just to get into Business Central, much, much lower. If you're a small customer with 2 users, that was a significant outlay for GP, as opposed to it's really, $70 per user, $210 a month for 3 users. So.
Right. Yep. So yeah, just to get set up on the system, a couple $100 a month for 3+ users, and you're up and running in minutes.
No, not minutes. Don't say
Well,
that, Steve.
Your environment is ready in minutes, right? A few clicks.
There you go.
Yes. You still have work to do, which we will talk about. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Steve Endo told me it would be set up in minutes.
yes, call Tanya to make that happen, right? Okay, here we go. So a GP versus Business Central customer, like what do those look like? Are those different? Are the two systems oriented or better for different customer sizes or different customer types? And I'm getting the impression not really. I think the party line or the common theme is what they call SMB, or small to mid-sized business. And that's a very vague, ambiguous term, but it's not enterprise, I guess, is the only way I could describe that. I think some GP users are 2 users and, a couple $1 million in revenue maybe. And then I mentioned that I've worked with a customer that was an $8 billion public company that used Business Central. So, I mean, it really, that used Dynamics GP. So Dynamics GP really covered the entire range of businesses in the United States, at least. Now, as I kind of referred to before, one thing that I do see might be a difference for a GP versus BC customer criteria would be that in GP, we could scale the hardware for higher transaction volumes. You could have a cluster of Citrix servers that could handle, dozens and dozens of end users, and you could scale up your SQL Server to have very, very high performance and high capacity. And you throw in a few more disks in the array, and you could have very large databases. So really, there wasn't really a capacity issue for all but the just insane volume customers. Now, Business Central SaaS, at least, the online version, we don't yet know if there is no hard limit to users, size, transaction volume, but we're not yet sure that the SaaS platform is maybe comfortable handling 500,000 transactions a day. We don't know what the capacity might be, and how long will it take to fill up that 80 gigabyte database limit, and then you would have to pay quite a bit more for additional database capacity. So those are the capacity question. I don't yet have a good answer for. But Business Central SaaS, I think, might be well suited for multinational and multi-language customers. So that's one thing it can do well, and seeing that it's web-based, you don't really have an on-premises footprint for servers and international remote access and logistical issues like that. And I did put some asterisks at the end of this because, let me get through the last point. There is Business Central on-prem as a product. That product is still available. So if you have customers that are going to have very high volume, critical uptime, or maybe have unreliable internet, they're in a remote region, something like that, BC on-prem is still an option. And our colleague Shannon Mullins, Business Central MVP, she had shared that she has implemented a hybrid for one of her manufacturing customers because they needed super high reliability on premises for their manufacturing. And then the rest of the accounting department could use SaaS for the remote web-based work. So that worked well for them. So that is another option. So the one point I want to mention about the multinational multi-language, it is my understanding that although you can have a US customer, a Europe customer, and an Asia customer, a customer with US, Europe, and Asia operations, if you want to have Business Central hosted in each of those regions, you must set up those environments or tenants in those regions separately. Those become essentially separate installs. And additionally, those regional installs and licensing must be licensed through a partner in that region. So a US partner, my understanding last time I heard this was that a US partner could not sell to a customer in Europe and in Asia and in the US and handle all of those tenants. Does that sound accurate?
That is what I have understood.
Yeah, exactly. I haven't been involved in that licensing, but definitely from the tenant perspective, it's true. With a lot of the integration projects I've been doing recently, it's included organizations like that where I have to bring together the European and the North American tenant.
And yes, and that's another good point. When you have a North American tenant, a European tenant, and perhaps an Asian tenant, or Australia, New Zealand, those are different tenants. So those systems aren't talking to each other. Your information isn't just magically flowing between Japan and United States, right? So that's where E1 Solutions, where Rod works, he works on those projects to pull that data together, maybe pull from Asia and push into the US or whatever the case is.
Is that usually on a company basis, though? That's what I'm just wondering, because I can have an employee who works in the UK and they would log in to the same company, and that's not necessarily what we're talking about, correct?
Correct.
Correct.
So, yeah, I don't know the limitation. Let's say you set up a North American tenant for a US customer, and they have a division in London, and that the users in London log in to that same tenant, but they just have the London company. I don't know what limitations exist. I believe that if you need, for instance, the Belgium version of Business Central,
right,
I don't know if you can have that as a Belgium company in the US tenant. You might have to have a Belgium European tenant.
And that's what we're talking about. So
Yep.
if you need another language, then you're going to have to be in a separate tenant. If everybody's dealing with, let's just say, English, then
Yep.
those people in the UK could log in to a US version of Business Central. It doesn't necessarily mean they have to be in a separate tenant.
Okay.
But if you
Good
need
point.
a different language, then it would
But
be, okay, now I cannot
also
have
comes
two in the
down
same tenant.
It also comes down to the data housing rules. So a lot of times a European company won't want their data held in the US. In fact, Canadian
Yep.
companies don't want their data held in the US. So
Why not?
it's
Can of worms.
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And also South Africa, I spoke with some people who run GP in South Africa, and they have very strict data protection rules. And my understanding is any SaaS services must have the data hosted in South Africa. So I think South African customers are in that situation as well.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about some functionality, or not, because I kind of hedged this one here. Okay. So functionality, which one is better? Which has more features? You know, which one can I check off more items on my checklist? Well, I will avoid that question by saying that both systems are very, very capable. Dynamics GP has tens of thousands of customers, at least in the United States, North America, South America, and many overseas installs. So it does its job very well. Core, GL, AP, AR, distribution. I know payroll in the US is very popular. It has excellent functionality and works great. Business Central, it comes from the Navision or Dynamics NAV lineage. A very, very capable system, very advanced features, lots of functionality. So it's not a simple better or worse. And they're in many ways not even directly comparable based on how they do things. Dynamics GP has some great features, works very well for certain customers. Business Central has other very powerful features that can facilitate operations and processes for other types of businesses. So it's not really a direct comparison, and it could be very much where you just need to work with a customer to see what are their requirements, what are their preferences, and which system might work better for them. So each system also has quirks and limitations, right? So Dynamics GP is not perfect, and neither is Business Central. If you speak with someone who's worked with either system long enough, you'll find a few things that they might grumble about, right? And fundamentally, each system does things differently. In Dynamics GP, for instance, we have GL accounts and account segments, and we have a separate module called Analytical Accounting, or MDA. And so that's how it handles that type of functionality, whereas Business Central has dimensions. And so it's kind of a fundamental difference in design and architecture. Any additional thoughts?
Well, Steve, we should have bleeped out those two curse words you said, analytical accounting and MDA, first of all.
Yes.
I'm kidding.
Yes. And there's an example right there. Like, MDA is a very powerful feature, but those of us who have had to support it, it just makes us internally groan and cringe when we hear it, because it means a lot more work for us. Whereas Business Central, it's just dimensions, and it's like, it's native throughout the entire application, and you don't have to expend any additional effort or concern that functionality is there. Yeah, it takes some setup, right?
Yep.
So.
Yeah, and two, remember the global dimensions, because you and I've had this conversation many, many times about the global dimensions are definitely all over the system. And sometimes when you go over those two global dimensions, it's kind of hard to find the data a little different. But yeah, I would agree with you.
That's a well-known quirk of Business Central, right? That the additional dimensions aren't always accessible. So exactly. Okay, cool.
So Steve, the only thing I want to add from the other day that we just did, or that we spoke about, was the it being ready, right? So we were talking about that the other day in our session that you'll have some people say, "Oh, well, Business Central's not ready," and Rod and I had a whole conversation about this. In that it's not necessarily not ready. It's Navision. It's Navision in the cloud. It has all of the functionality that most of the GP people have. And as Steve said, it's just different, but it's absolutely a fully functional system. So
it also boils down to implementation when it comes to that, as far as the ready comes in. When I worked with it, even in the very early days, when everybody said it's absolutely not ready, I was able to run a business on it. It just depended how you implemented each feature and what exactly you consider needing.
Right.
Yeah, I
totally agree.
As I learn about Business Central, and I'm focusing more on the technical and development side, but I'm working with you, Tanya, on the functional and getting those two worlds to merge. There is a ton of functionality in Business Central. It is a very advanced, capable, and sometimes complex system. So it is by no means, I recall early days that there were often comparisons to QuickBooks. And that, I think, is absolutely dishonest. I mean, it's completely inaccurate.
Yes.
It is not QuickBooks. It is full-on business-grade ERP, even enterprise-grade ERP. I mean, it's got a lot of functionality.
That was partly Microsoft's fault, though, because they did try to pitch it as the between QuickBooks and Nav solution, which
the early version, I think that's where they were trying to go, and if I recall correctly, that strategy did not last long. So they finally opened up all the functionality, and now we have full-blown Nav in the Business Central SaaS.
Yep.
Okay, so where's my button here? Here we go. Okay, so let me make sure I didn't skip a slide. Nope. Okay. ISV Solutions, Dynamics GP. Anyone who's been in the Dynamics GP space or used the software knows, probably has used an ISV solution to supplement and enhance GP. Very, very mature ISV marketplace, hundreds of ISV solutions. If you've attended the user group summit, You've seen all of those booths in the conference hall, just hundreds of booths offering solutions for Dynamics GP. So a very, very strong ISV marketplace. And there is also a great relationship and coordination between the Dynamics GP partners, and the corresponding ISV channel. So it's really just a well-oiled machine from my experience. Partners know how to offer those solutions, customers know how to use them and integrate them, and it works well. Business Central is a relatively new ISV marketplace, and that's called the Appsource marketplace. It is growing, but a couple challenges. It is new, so people are learning how to get involved in that. And it is international, very much international. So Dynamics GP was often a very US-centric ISV marketplace, whereas the Appsource apps for Business Central are sometimes offered only in Europe or only in Asia or only in certain countries. Like maybe you only have this Belgian add-on that provides a specific piece of functionality that Belgian customers would need. So it's a much larger discussion when it comes to ISV solutions in Business Central, but it is a growing and vibrant marketplace. The Appsource, I believe the goal is to make those solutions essentially a click-to-install solution, very similar to a mobile phone app where you can just click install, it'll be installed in your tenant, and you'll be ready to try it on a trial basis or purchase it. There are some caveats to that, which we can discuss at the end of the slide. And many of the ISV solutions, I believe, use subscription licensing. So that's a little different than the traditional on-prem GP licensing for ISVs. And there are some monetization challenges for new ISVs. How do you get into the Appsource marketplace, get listed? How do you offer trials and subscriptions? And do you charge credit cards? Do you build a customer? How do you manage that subscription process? So that has been a challenge. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think of the idea of a customer being able to click on an app in Appsource and install it into their environment?
Scary.
I honestly think it's a little scary. Yeah. Especially since a lot of customers aren't working in their sandbox when they first do it. They're in their production environment and they're implementing these modules. Most of them have very good rollbacks from what I've experienced. So if you choose not to use it, it uninstalls itself fairly cleanly. But I mean, it's scary.
Yep.
Yeah. Have you had any customers just start clicking on things and installing them, Tanya?
I have actually. And then, of course, they were not able to access things inside of Business Central, one of them being multi-entity management, which was, it's a pretty big module to install. Yep. So, yeah, I definitely think there needs to be a little more control around just saying, hey, I want a free trial of this. When I'm teaching customers, that's one of the very first things is I show them the marketplace, and I tell them absolutely do not just install anything in your production environment. Go to your sandbox and do it in your sandbox because it is a completely separate tenant.
And I recently saw this conversation come up on Twitter where a customer had installed something. And are there controls that you can enable to prevent this or really limit the admin users who can do this? It's through the admin center, right?
The security. Yeah. Well, it's through the setup and extensions at the top. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So you could lock the security down on those users so they can't do it.
Got it. Okay.
And not be a super user, which some people don't do, unfortunately.
No, people use SA as their login?
Not SA, but everybody. Let's just make everybody a super user so we don't have to worry about security.
Yep, and password is password.
As an ISV,
not a great idea.
As someone who works for an ISV, Steve, the concept of a free trial is really tough because sometimes it's just not something that it's not like downloading, poker to your iPhone and it just kind of open it and it works. There's configuration and stuff to learn. And you don't get that from a free trial. So we've actually had customers who have said from their free trial, I couldn't make it work, so it's not a good product. It's just that they weren't properly trained, right? And they didn't talk to somebody who was.
Yes, and that is an excellent point. And I think the same thing goes for Business Central, right? If a customer goes direct to the Business Central website and is able to sign up, even the free trial, like when I tried to use Business Central, I was like, this is pretty disorienting. It was new to me. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know how to set it up or use it. And I was like, oh, those free trials can actually discourage a user if they don't have someone helping them walk through that process. So I think 100%. That's a good point. Yep. Okay. So Tanya, can you share with us what it looks like to implement GP versus Business Central?
I was like, do I get a slide?
Yes, here's your slide.
All right, perfect. So, I get when I first started doing a lot of implementations, some of the partners that I worked with would say, oh, you can implement it yourself or we can help you. But why don't you try to self-implement? And I was like ready to duct tape that person's mouth because I just said, don't tell people that. It's awful. Because what would happen is people would try to self-implement. They, like Steve just said, they would get frustrated. And they, would be like, I can't get this to work. And I'm spending 10 times longer trying to figure it out. So yes, you can self-implement it. There is a lot of learning, which Steve is going to kind of also touch on a little bit later. But if you have somebody just spend a little bit of time with you, walking you through it, it is absolutely a much better experience. So one of the biggest differences, as Steve said earlier, was, you can be up and running in a couple of minutes. Well, that is true on the installation side because deploying a tenant is actually very, very simple. Making copies, making sandboxes, all of that is a very simple process. Installing GP with SQL and everything else obviously was not. Setup-wise, yes, you can do a blank company in Business Central. I don't recommend it because there's a lot of things that are missed on that setup. So it kind of has a setup of a production, master data. And then you can go in and change that master data. So, in GP, they had that, really nobody used it. So you are still having to do a lot of that setup, just like you did in GP. Training is exactly the same, a little bit easier in Business Central because, you're doing maybe a couple hours at a time. I feel like I do a lot of reviews in Business Central. And then, of course, go live support and all of that. I do find that people, because we're not face-to-face a lot in a Business Central environment, that I do a more support after because they call me and they say, okay, now I'm ready to do, X. I want to, enhance my account schedules or I want to add fixed assets. I just had a call right before this and it was like, okay, now that we're up and running, these are the 5 things that we want to do, which I think is the perfect environment.
Okay. And so for the numbers that you put up there, this is just like kind of a hypothetical guess estimate. Obviously, a small customer and a large customer and complex requirements integrations, those are two different things. But we were just trying to, you were just trying to offer some hypothetical example of how these might be different for a given scenario. And that BC, it looks like the deployment and the configuration, that generally takes less time. But well, as you mentioned, go live and support, post go live support may not be any different because customers are still getting used to the system and will have a lot of questions.
Yeah. And I don't think you're spending as much time with the customers like we used to do in GP. We go on site and sit there for 3 days and teach them something. And I think I said the other day, one thing that I do notice in the BC environment, because we're not face-to-face, which we could be in the future, absolutely, because I have done BC implementations on site too. But I feel like, it's this person is doing AP, this person's doing AR, this person does credit cards, and everybody does a little bit things differently. So you're still spending that training time, and people are still not knowing how to do stuff. But I just feel like it's a little more streamlined than GP.
Okay, cool. Okay.
Rod, I don't know if you have anything to add on that one.
I think
He's like,
from an implementation standpoint, one important thing for me is that it's really easily configurable for a small startup company. I think I talked about this the other day, where you can use that basic install, and they could literally, to borrow Steve's phrase, not be up and running in 5 minutes, but they could be up and running that day, right? Realistically,
right.
if most of the configuration will do most of what they do, you could literally issue an invoice on day one. The nice thing about it is it's also easy to change a lot of those configurations. For my own implementation, I completely redid my chart of accounts 2 months after I went live.
Me too.
And it was like a really quick fix to change that chart of accounts after the fact. Whereas GP, that's a big exercise that would be, a multi-week chronologically and many hours of consulting time. So I think there is some flexibility that BC brings to the table that GP didn't have.
Interesting. Yeah. And so that it makes it a little more, what's the word? It's a little more lenient on your initial setup and configuration, right? So in GP, you make a mistake in some of the setup and configuration, that can be painful, and you have to buy a tool to restructure your accounts or change or whatever those tools are called. Not a fun process. So that's interesting. Nope. Okay, so what do we have next here? Learning. Okay, let's see here.
This is all you.
Okay, so
this is all you,
learning.
Steve.
Okay, boy, lots of learning. So those of you who have been in the Dynamics GP space for a while will know that the GP documentation as of today is not stellar. It does exist technically, but most of the documentation that I find was last updated in 2013, and there just was no budget and no effort to update that subsequently. So documentation is old, out of date, which is not terribly helpful for people looking to learn. And there were also just big chunks of content that were not really well covered. So on the development side, it wasn't like there was widely available open source public documentation on how to do Dynamics GP development, at least on the .NET side. There may be documentation on the Dexterity side, but again, you would have to have access to that, which typically you needed to be a partner or a customer who paid for it. It was behind a paywall of sorts. There is lots of searchable online content. So one great thing about Dynamics GP is if you encounter an error, you just Google it, and 99% of the time you are going to find multiple relevant results. That is one excellent thing about Dynamics GP. There's 15 plus years of online content covering techniques, online error messages, how to do things, features, functions, etc. There are active user groups and conferences, so you can often get training through those. I don't know how long those are going to continue for the GP track, but those have been historically a great place for users and consultants to get trained. Business Central is a little different. I guess it's more the trendy, put everything online and not open source, but kind of open information. And it's not really, it's not as controlled and it's not restricted. It's not put behind a partner or licensed customer barriers. It's open to the world. So anyone, anywhere, as far as I know, there may be some regional restrictions or country restrictions, for legal reasons or regulatory reasons. But if you're in a supported region, anyone can sign up for a 100% free, fully functional, or for the essentials data set, free SaaS sandbox for Business Central. This is pretty amazing. This was very difficult for a new person or a new customer, a new consultant to get access to in the GP world. In Business Central, anyone can go and sign up and get that environment set up. So there are effectively zero barriers to entry and zero barriers to learning other than the effort. There are now quite a few MS Learn courses. I think I counted, I forget what the number is. It's on my blog post, the BC Information blog post. Hundreds of little modules, learning modules for Business Central. So that's been excellent. There is actively maintained online documentation. Microsoft is actively maintaining all of that online. You can submit a page correction or a suggestion via a GitHub suggestion or issue report, I believe it's called. Hundreds of free online learning modules, hundreds of free YouTube videos. There are entire years worth of online training videos of NAV and Business Central on YouTube by training organizations. And of course, there are the traditional paid training classes from a longtime Navision or Business Central partners. So from my perspective, hello, Tanya. We're back.
I had to sneeze.
Sorry about that. Welcome to live streaming, folks. Okay, I can go back to the slide.
Rod, I have to sneeze. That was too funny. I'm like, oh my gosh, I gotta sneeze, and I was trying to get away from the microphone.
I forgot to check the feed to see if you were ready. Sorry about that. Okay. So,
I'm good.
Anyway, it's Friday afternoon. So anyway,
it is
tons and tons of resources on the Business Central side. I think it takes a little more work now to get that same level of content and learning resources on GP. Definitely possible if you try hard and ask around. But Business Central, it's just a Google query away. So, and Waldo says, bless you.
Thank you. Hi, Waldo.
So, okay. So, learning, I think I'm going to give BC some edge there because there's just a lot more effort being put into it fresh at the moment. So, next up, development. Yes. Here we go.
Oh, this is all Steve for sure.
Yes. So I am a huge cheerleader when it comes to Business Central development. GP did have a good development tool set. There was the native dexterity development environment. And what was fantastic was when they released the Visual Studio Tools toolset that allowed .NET developers to have a lot of capability in terms of customizations, integrations, and control. Not quite the level of dexterity, but really fantastic toolset there. And then there's the ubiquitous eConnect, kind of like an API for Dynamics GP. Those are off the top of my head. There are a few others, but I'd say these are the primary three that come to mind for me. Now, one of the challenges is that dexterity has a learning curve, and you typically need to have, I believe you need to attend the training classes for that. I don't know how easy it is to come up to speed on that just off of the dexterity documentation, but you typically take a formal class for that. And they had those at conferences. And then Visual Studio Tools was kind of a do-it-yourself and learn from documentation. That was pretty good. But most of this was either required a license or it was kind of restricted access, and a partner could download it or a customer could download it, but a person who had never worked with GP before did not really have access to it. And so the barrier to entry was often high for people who were not part of the community or not a registered partner. So that made it difficult for some people. Business Central is a completely open model. 100% free for any developer in the world who wants to come up to speed with Business Central and learn to develop with it. Zero barriers to entry or learning. You do not need to be a partner. You do not need to be registered with Microsoft. You don't need to buy anything. No licenses, no partner registration fee, absolutely no requirements. You have the free Visual Studio Code, free Docker Desktop, or even the Enterprise Edition on Windows Server, free PowerShell, Visual Studio Code extensions. Many of them are graciously developed and offered for free by the developers of the BC community. Really, really amazing tool set. And these are the brand new modern tools in the Microsoft world, VS Code and Docker and PowerShell. They are just on fire right now in the development community. The AL language is documented and widely accessible. You can also get access to the Business Central source code. You can pull that up in Visual Studio Code. You can download the Microsoft supplied extensions and actually look at the source code for a Business Central page, Business Central API, and you can copy that to make your own. So all of that is accessible. If you have an issue with anything, you can go to GitHub and submit an issue, and the actual Microsoft development team is reviewing that. There's full visibility as to what's going on. They can get those suggestions more easily. You can submit them easily, and you can track the status or get feedback on those issues. So that's amazing. Web APIs, webhook, OAuth, all native to the platform. It's really, really a phenomenal platform to develop on. And there are over 30,000 standard tests that you can install in a Business Central development environment, and you can create your own. So if you're familiar with Visual Studio testing, it's very similar, where you can write and develop your own tests in Business Central AL to fully automate your testing process for your customizations or extensions. And all of that works together and gets pushed into Azure DevOps using Git, and you can use the DevOps platform to create your continuous integration, continuous deployment pipelines. So it'll compile your code, it'll build your solution, it'll run your tests, and it can even deploy the end solution in test environments or customer environments. So with that rant, it is an absolutely amazing development environment, just so modern, and it is being extended and advanced every single day. Very, very powerful development environment. Any thoughts on that from you two?
I think from a development perspective, I mean, you're, of the three of us, you're obviously the code guy. For me, I've always been more of an integration between two existing systems, so moving data from one spot to another. And from that perspective, in GP, we had eConnect as our way in to GP to apply all that business logic. And it was pretty limited. So, for example, it didn't cover manufacturing at all. Right. There were a lot of payroll that it didn't cover. It didn't touch Canadian payroll at all, stuff like that. Whereas with the Business Central, you can publish any page for any ISV or any extension you've built yourself. You can publish that as a page, or use the existing APIs, or write your own APIs to push data in and have all the business rules applied. And to get data out, from my perspective, it's a pretty amazing integration technology.
That is an excellent point. Now, if Microsoft is currently recommending, they would prefer that you use their new web API over the legacy web services and OData endpoints, but the accessibility of data through the web services and OData endpoints is phenomenal. And if you do have a development resource, I can attest that a basic custom web API is extremely easy to do. So I did a separate live stream where, not knowing anything, I created my first Business Central API to extend the functionality of the standard vendor API. So I wanted to add some fields. In this case, it was the 1099 fields for a vendor. I wanted to make those accessible via the API. I was able to create my fully custom API. I had my own URL, my own versioning, all from Visual Studio Code, and it literally can take minutes once you know how to do it. So unbelievably powerful platform for getting data in and out. And of course, that's required because we don't have access to the SQL Server.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So excellent point. Okay. So we had a few questions when we did this last. So let me just run down those. We'll just glance at them and then talk about them. So we had a question about that 80 gigabyte database limit, and Rod looked that up, and it looks like that is a per tenant limitation. So if you have, say, 5 company databases, the total of those 5 is must fall within the 80 gigabyte database limit. And there is the ability to apparently to purchase additional capacity, but our understanding it is quite expensive to purchase additional database capacity. Rod, you mentioned US and Canadian payroll, that those are available as ISV solutions, correct?
Correct. I believe there's two. Tanya can speak to that more. I haven't dealt with the US, but there is a Canadian payroll module that came from, I believe it's InsightWorks, that came out really early in the game. They were really quick to market with that. And then Tanya, I think you'll have to refresh me on the US ones.
The Integrity Data Payroll Now, which is inside of Business Central, and then Green Shades does have their payroll module as well, but it is external. It's actually not inside of Business Central. I haven't used the Green Shades yet, but I have used the Payroll Now. I've done an implementation for the Payroll Now payroll module, and I definitely liked it. A lot of features.
Okay. I was the same on the InsightWorks. I used it internally, and I was very happy with it.
So one of the questions was, how do I get a test environment? And Business Central, Eric Hugard has a YouTube video on this, and I think I might have mentioned it in a blog post as well, but there is a free sign-up process. Now, it is not quite obvious if you don't want to associate it with your main business email account or an existing Microsoft account. There is kind of a side channel where you can register and make up an email address to be used for your login. But it is free, only takes a few minutes. And it doesn't cost anything. GP to BC data migration. Tanya and Rod.
So, yeah, I'll start with the standard and we can go into Rod. So on going from GP to BC, there is definitely some blog post out there. I think Desiree did one recently. And Jen Rance had a really good video too, very, very detailed, but GP to BC, there's the configuration packages or rapid start. I don't use the rapid start very often because I feel like there's always fields that I'm missing. I will go ahead and build my own configuration packages. You can use the migration tool, which essentially just takes the data from GP and puts it into Business Central. And I think that's called the Intelligent Cloud also that works with that. The Intelligent Cloud I didn't love because a lot of people take the time to actually revamp their chart of accounts. And if they do that, you essentially the migration tool really doesn't work. And a lot of times you're also coming from a customer who is probably expired. They're 2013 or 2010, something like that. And then of course that migration tool doesn't work there either. So I've used it, but I haven't used it in a live production because, like I said, a lot of customers are just like, hey, I'm not going to update GP, and why don't I just, fix my chart of accounts now that I've been wanting to fix for 5 years and never did. So
right.
And
that's
clean up
kind
your
of my
customers, your
migration.
vendors, and fix your billing process and fix everything that's wrong. You should be re-implementing anyway.
Yeah. And so although
I absolutely agree.
There may be an inclination to try and avoid the additional cost or hassle of the, quote, re-implementation, it's also an opportunity because when you implemented Dynamics GP 10 plus years ago, your business was different. And now 10 plus years later, not only would you want to change some things, but you'll probably want to do certain things differently in Business Central than you did in GP because they are slightly different systems. Yep. So your chart of accounts.
And it's usually not the same person.
Right.
Is what I'm finding. It's not even the same person running the show now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, just account segments to dimensions. I don't know that you just want to slam those same segments into Business Central. Okay, cool.
Correct.
And regarding historical data,
don't
go
do
for it.
What
do you think, Rod? What is the alternative to importing historical data?
So Microsoft's actually come up with this thing where it's moving your GP data out to a data lake, which you can then report on using different tools. The shortcomings of that particular conversion tool, though, is it's only grabbing core GP tables, and it grabs the actual tables. So you're getting SOP 10100. You're not getting plain English names like most of the reporting tools would give you. So that's one way that you could go. We've been working with folks. We have a tool called PopDoc. Here's my shameless plug. So we have a tool called PopDoc, which we've been using with folks where they could either leave GPT where it is, they could move it to a data lake. We have a conversion tool where we can move it with the plain English names. We can put it out on Azure SQL, wherever you want your GP historical data, and you can build a PopDoc report that would combine that data with your Business Central data and then embed that inside Business Central. So your users think it's there in BC. They're seeing a complete customer history, a complete vendor history, but you don't have to go through that incredibly painful conversion of getting history into the new system.
Yeah, and if anyone watching uses GP or BC, and if you haven't seen PopDoc, if you have data from other systems that you want accessible, it's a pretty powerful tool. So you could have just your GP data sitting off on the side, but it can appear almost seamlessly within a web browser in Business Central. And I think the concern around historical data is accessibility, right? I mean, customers aren't going to work with those historical transactions. They're historical transactions. They just need access to them for visibility and reporting purposes.
And I will tack on that anybody who is listening, who's a GP customer who has Smart Connect, your Smart Connect works with Business Central as well. So you can actually use Smart Connect to do a lot of what Tanya mentioned with the configuration packages. That same master data conversion will work within Smart Connect as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. So
Nice.
GP customers looking to migrate to Business Central, if you already use Smart Connect, then that's an obvious fit there. Cool. Okay. Well, that wrapped it up. Were there? Excuse me. One more thing that someone asked about. What are the options for financial reporting in Business Central? Tanya?
So I just did a Dynamics Con session today too on reporting. So yep, there we go. Another shameless plug for Dynamics Con. But we talked about a lot of the different reporting in there. So financial reporting, I call it, if anybody used advanced financials in GP, which almost nobody did, it is better than advanced financials, but not as good as FRX and Management Reporter. However, there's third parties out there that are available for that. I also have used Power BI using the OData web services for, just plugging those in, and some of the APIs, just doing that in Power BI. So you still have the access to the data through either Excel or Power BI with those OData. And it's just kind of, getting somebody to help you write those reports, basically.
So there are tools,
So.
but the out-of-the-box BC financial reporting tool may not meet your needs.
If they're
especially if
really
you have to
complex,
send
I
them.
would say, yeah, if you're doing a lot of stuff. I mean, you can send them to Excel, you can send them to a PDF, or print
Right.
them to those things. So, I mean, you can do that. If you get into the column layouts, you can use dimensions with the column layouts. So you just have to have somebody who understands how to do the account schedules a little bit better and the column layouts. And if it's basic, I'll say a little more than advanced basic, you can definitely make it work.
Okay, cool. Rod, did you have something there?
No, I was just going to say it definitely doesn't have the complexity of an FRX or a management reporter where
Got it.
the columns all over the place.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for coming together on a Friday afternoon. I think it is a lot of valuable information. So with that, have a good weekend and enjoy.
Thanks, you too.
Thank you. You as well.